When was the book of Revelation written?
A quick Google search will say somewhere between 95 and 98 AD.
But why should we believe that claim?
There are a great number of church fathers that take this same view, but we have to look back a little bit further to see where it stems from. Forgive me in advance if I mispronounce some of these names. A very prominent and important church writer, Irenaeus, wrote in between 180 and 190 AD against heresies. In Book 5 he says this: "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist, for if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who upheld the apocalyptic vision, for that was seen not very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign." It's important to note that many, if not most, of the church fathers talking about this particular instance are quoting from Irenaeus here. That being said, it's very important to verify that this is correct. There are many experts and scholars as well as church fathers that believe that there was some ambiguity in the translation of this particular text. I'm going to read a passage by S.H. Chase. This was written in 1889. The logic of the sentences seems to me to require this interpretation. The statement that the vision was seen at the close of Domitian's reign supplies no reason why the mysterious numbers should have been expounded by him who saw the apocalypse, had he judged such an exposition needful. If, on the other hand, we refer to this word to St. John, the meaning is plain and simple. We may expand the sentences thus: had it been needful that the explanation of the name should be proclaimed to the men of our own day, that explanation would have been given by the author of the book. For the author was seen on earth, he lived and held converse with his disciples not so very long ago, but almost in our own generation. Thus, on one hand, he lived years after he wrote the book, and there was abundant opportunity for him to expound the riddle, which he wished to do so, had he wished to do so. And on the other hand, since he lived on almost into our generation, the explanation, had he given it, must have been preserved to us. The reason for explaining this is there's ambiguity in the text and in the translation that leads us to believe that it might not be wholly reliable. Another reason to cite this first is that a future church fathers after Irenaeus here are quoting him and just making the assumption that what he said is the correct interpretation. That particular line of thinking becomes suspect. There will be quite a few parts to this series, so I encourage you to stick around for a little bit more information. This is a part 2, so if you haven't listened to the first part, go back and take a listen. So in the first part here, we laid out some reasons why the interpretation of the writings of Irenaeus should be re-examined and taken another look at. Mainly, again, because many of the church fathers that soon followed after him quoted and took for granted some of the interpretations thereof. In ecclesiastical history, Eusebius again cites Irenaeus' statements from Against Heresies here. In his writing and in quoting Irenaeus, he says this: "As these things are so, and this number is found in all the approved and ancient copies, and those who saw John face to face confirm it." Attention should be given here to the personal knowledge that is emphasized here by Irenaeus. Those who have seen John face to face testify. And then this was again written again by Eusebius. George Edmondson of the University of Oxford says this: "But surely this rendering, the common rendering of Irenaeus, is wrong. It should be, for he, St. John the writer, has seen, almost in our generation, toward the end of the reign of Domitian. It is of the seer and his ability to declare the name of Antichrist that Irenaeus is speaking. The misunderstanding about the meaning of the passage is largely due to Eusebius, who, after a reference to Domitian's persecution proceeds in this persecution report, he affirms that the apostle and evangelist John, who was still living in consequence of his testimony to the divine word, was condemned to dwell on the island of Patmos." And then he quotes Irenaeus in support of this statement. He concludes that Eusebius imparted this wrong historical data as a result of reading too much into Origen's comments on Matthew 20:22. Apparently, Eusebius merely assumed that John was exiled to Patmos under Domitian based on Origen's obscure comment. Edmondson thus surmised that this led Eusebius astray in his historical arrangement of the data at this point. A couple more pieces of note here. Tertullian placed John's banishment after his being dipped in a cauldron of burning oil, which Jerome says was in Nero's range. Fotis preserved extracts of Life of Timotheus in which he states that John's banishment was under Nero. 3 others that support this claim: Epiphanius, Erithus, and Theophylact. One other thing to note is that Irenaeus has been known to make some historically inaccurate statements. The most famous misclaim was that Jesus possibly lived to the age of 40, when we know pretty much certainly that his ministry started at age 30 and he died at age 33 and rose again. I certainly don't want to take away from the work or testimony of Irenaeus. It's very important, but in view of what Origen has said, how can we well suppose that the opinion was formed in any other way than by his own interpretation of Revelation 1:9? This is part 3 of this series, and I recommend you go back and take a listen to parts 1 and 2. Clement of Alexandria was a presbyter in the Church of Alexandria from about AD 189 until his death, and this argument is used for later date proponents of the writing of the book of Revelation. This line I'm about to read is what's commonly used. When after the death of the tyrant he removed from the island of Patmos to Ephesus. This is of course referring to John. So the main crux of this is, who is the tyrant that's being referred to here? It's obvious that the word Domitian is not used here, so that we need to make that clear first of all. However, that is the claim being made, is that the tyrant is Domitian, and that John left Patmos to Ephesus after the death of Domitian. But again, is the word tyrant referring to him or perhaps someone else, say Nero? Pliny the Elder, a contemporary of Nero who died in the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79, described Nero as the destroyer of the human race, the poison of the world. Apollonius of Tyana says this: "In my travels, which have been wider than ever man yet accomplished, I have seen many, many wild beasts of Arabia and India, but this beast, that is commonly called a tyrant, I know not how many heads it has," in referring to Nero. I know not how many heads it has? Keep that in mind. Nero was so dreaded, in fact, that many years after his death, rumors pervaded and kept going and going, even decades later, that he was going to come back and take over the world a second time. These rumors can be found in the writings of Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, Zonara, Dion Chrysostom, and Augustine, among other writers. On top of this, in many Jewish oracles, this same kind of thing is mentioned as well, Nero and coming back and all of that. In Book 8 of the Sibylline Oracles, Nero is described as the Great Beast. In Sibylline Oracles Book 12, he is called terrible and frightful, a terrible snake, one engaged in making himself equal to God. In regards to his persecution of Christians, Tacitus wrote that Nero inflicted unheard of punishments on those who, detested for their abominable crimes, were vulgarly called Christians. Sulpicius Severus, great name, wrote this: "As to Nero, I shall not say that he was the worst of kings, but he was worthiest held the basest of all men, and even of wild beasts. It was he who first began a persecution," referring to the crucifixion of Peter and the slewing of Paul. He even associates Nero with the prophecy of Revelation. It was accordingly believed that even if he did put an end to himself with a sword, his wound was cured and his life preserved according to that which was written regarding him, and his mortal wound was healed. Revelation 13:3. The tyrant being referred to here is Nero. This is part 4, so go back and listen to the first 3. In the last part, we talked about Clement of Alexandria and his writings, and there was another thing of note that he wrote about John that is quite interesting if you consider the age and the time of which Revelation was written, as well as the age of John and when he did these things. So I'll read this part again as well as the part after. "When after the death of the tyrant he removed from the island of Patmos to Ephesus," which we've already established the tyrant was most likely Nero. "He used to journey by request to the neighboring districts of the Gentiles, in some places to appoint bishops, in others to regulate whole churches, and others to set among the clergy some one man, it may be, of those indicated by the Spirit." So if this had been in the time of Domitian, that would have put John in his 90s. This alone seems to be pretty unlikely that a man in his 90s can continue to do these things. But here's another point as to why that might not have been the case as well. There's an account that Clement immediately adds to this story, in which John, disturbed by a young church leader's forsaking of the faith, chased him on horseback with all of his might. And he records the matter thus: when he recognized John as he advanced, he turned ashamed to flight. The other followed with all of his might, meaning John, forgetting his age, crying, "Why, my son, dost thou flee from me? Thy father, unarmed, old, son, pity me." All of this is quite strenuous missionary activity for a man in his 90s. Impossible? No. Empowered by the Spirit? Makes it way more likely. But if we just go by our base understanding of whether a 90-year-old man could do these kind of things, kind of unlikely. However, if the tyrant that was being referred to was Nero, that would have made John 25 years younger than here. A 65-year-old man, a lot more likely to be able to do these kind of things, wouldn't you say? Clement then goes on to write this as well: "For the teaching of our Lord at his advent, beginning with Augustus and Tiberius, was completed in the middle of the times of Tiberius, and that of the apostles, embracing the ministry of Paul, ends with Nero." How could this statement have been made if John's revelation had been written 25 years after Nero? These things, as well as many other things I've read, has led me to believe that Clement did not adopt a late date theory about the writing of Revelation at all. I'm going to post you a conclusion here from the book I'm reading, and you can pause to read. As I highlighted there at the very end, I think it's clear that Clement favored Nero rather than Domitian as the tyrant that's being referred to here. So this is a part 5, so if you haven't listened to the first 4, go listen to those. Now the previous 4, as well as this one and probably a couple more parts, are going to deal with the external sources dating the book of Revelation. I'm not a huge fan of not just using just the Bible, but we have to look at other sources here. So just bear with me until we get to the meaty part, if you will. The next early writer we're going to look at is the Shepherd of Hermes. There are a few schools of thought as to who this is and who is the actual author of this. The one I'm adhering to is that Hermes was the one greeted by Paul in Romans 16:14, as confirmed by Origen as well. There is some debate as to when this was written, but here are a list of people that adhere to an earlier writing, most likely between 90 and 100 AD. Cotelier, Cave, Lardner, Galandi, Lumper, Lockman, and Sprinzel, as well as Schaff. Just so you know, these are all church history writers. As to earlier writers that adhere to the earlier writing of the Shepherd of Hermes, we have Irenaeus, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius, and Jerome. In addition to that, the Shepherd is included in the Codex Sinaiticus, which indicates a strong respect for its authority. Further still, there are some that even put this at an earlier date, Lightfoot being one of them, saying, since the universally admitted requirement for this would be that they were considered to be the work of at least an associate of the apostles, a date of about 75 to 80 would be much more likely. Why are we pointing all this out, and why are we claiming its authority and showing why it matters? Is because Revelation is quoted in Hermes freely. Here are some excerpts that use the same imagery as Revelation. The church is represented by a woman, the enemy of the church by a beast. Out of the mouth of the beast proceed fiery locusts. The foundation stones of the heavenly Jerusalem bear the names of the 12 apostles, and those who overcome are made pillars in the spiritual temple. Apostles and other teachers of the church form the stones of the heavenly tower erected by the archangels. The faithful in both are clothed in white and are given crowns to wear. And I can't word it any better, so I'm going just to read this conclusion. If a date in the 8080s be given to the shepherd, as is most plausible, and if the apparent allusions to Revelation in it are expressive of its dependency upon Revelation, as certainly seems the case, then Revelation influenced the writing of the shepherd in the late 8080s. For John's revelation to have been written, to have been copied laboriously by hand, to have made its way to Rome by the 80s, and to have influenced the writing of another work would be a strong indication that it existed a good deal of time before AD 85. It would thus be evidence against a date of AD 95 and supportive of a pre-AD 70 date. This is a part 6, so if you haven't listened to the first 5, go do so. Continuing on in some external sources for the reasoning that Revelation was written before AD 70. Some of these will be a little rapid fire, so bear with me. Papias of Hierapolis was a disciple of the Apostle John and a friend of Polycarp. His major work, Exposition of the Lord's Oracles, seems to have been lost in time somewhere around the year 1218. They have been cited in other works and provide some strong external evidence for the pre-AD 70 composition of Revelation. In 1740, there were some manuscripts found by L.A. Muratori that have been called the Muratorian Canon. Granted, the authorship of these is not confirmed, but we have a pretty strong case as to who it might have been. This person was a contemporary of Pius, Bishop of Rome, sometime between AD 127 and 157. Others believe this could have been Caius, Presbyter of Rome, around the year 200. If it was written by Caius, it makes sense to note that he was a student of Irenaeus, which we discussed earlier. Here's an excerpt from that writing. The blessed Apostle Paul, following the rule of his predecessor John, writes to no more than 7 churches by name. Following the rule of his predecessor John. John too, indeed, in the Apocalypse, although he writes to only 7 churches, yet addresses all. This seems to indicate that John's writing preceded Paul's writings. It is widely confirmed that Paul died before AD 70, probably in 67 or 68 AD. This is yet another indicator of a pre-AD 70 writing of the book of Revelation. Now we have Tertullian, AD 160 to 220, the first major theologian to write in Latin. In his writing Exclusion of Heretics, it is strongly suggested that John's banishment occurred at the same time Peter and Paul suffered martyrdom. Later, Jerome certainly understood Tertullian to state that John was banished by Nero. Tertullian writes, the Apostle John was plunged into boiling oil and suffered nothing, and was afterwards banished to an island. We know that that happened during the reign of Nero. I do find it interesting that it says he suffered nothing. So was he delivered from that miraculously? Maybe. Now granted, this is an argument from silence, but when Tertullian speaks of Domitian's evil in the 5th chapter of his Apology, he does not mention anything about John's banishment or suffering under him. Now again, this is an argument from silence, but it's strange that he didn't mention that. Here we can tie what Tertullian wrote to Tacitus in the attempted oil killing of John in AD 64, to which he was moved to sympathy for the Christians by Nero's actions. So Tertullian and Jerome affirm that John was boiled in oil, affirmed also by Tacitus, who was there, AD 64, by... So this is a part 7. If you haven't listened to the first 6, please go back and do so. Also, thanks for hanging with me on this subject. I think it's fascinating and important, but a little bit heady, and I get that. Once we get through some of the external sources, I'm pretty sure once we get into the word a little bit more itself, it's going to be a lot more exciting. So the next early writings we have to look at is Origen. Origen is very typically cited as one of the leading external witnesses for the later date of Revelation being written. The debated statement is this: the king of the Romans, tradition teaches, condemned John, who bore testimony on account of the word of truth, to the Isle of Patmos. So just the same that we looked at the word tyrant and who that was referring to, the same can be applied here as to who we're talking about, the king of the Romans. Granted, this is also an argument from silence, but the emperor who banished John is not named either by Clement or Origen. The use of this argument is that it was presumed to be talking about Domitian. Now, Clement seems to teach that John was exiled under Nero, and it's probably in bygone conclusion that Origen would have picked up on his master in that regard. It is the opinion of some that this is indicative of Nero. Throughout the East, the Julian Caesars were looked upon as a royal line and hailed as kings. Nero was the last of them. After him came the successful generals raised to the purple by their legions. They took the title of Caesar but prefixed it to their own names. They reigned by virtue of their leadership of the army. The official title of Domitian illustrates both these points. It is by presumption alone that Domitian is accredited as the king of the Romans, when he would have not been called king by most of these people. Victorinus, bishop of Patau, states that when John said these things, he was in the island of Patmos, condemned to the labor of the mines by Caesar Domitian. This particular passage would lead us to have to believe that in 96, John must have been somewhere between 90 and 100 years old. We're asked to believe that at the great age he was able to stand the journey as a prisoner from Ephesus to Rome, to go through a trial before the emperor, to be scourged publicly and cruelly in the Forum, to be banished to Patmos and to work under the lash in the mines, and after enduring all of this, return to Ephesus still possessed of enough vigor to reorganize the churches of Asia and to survive in spite of all this activity for several years more, and as we looked at earlier, ride a horse behind at full gallop someone that he was chasing at this age? Suspect. Look, John was awesome, and with God anything is possible, but I'm just not seeing this John Wayne kind of moment at a 96 or 97 or however old he was. For this reason, I'm writing off Victorinus as an evidence for a later date. This is a part 8 of When Was Revelation Written. We are nearing the end of this phase of my study of Revelation in regards to when it was written. I'm looking at the external sources. The next phase of this series is going to be looking at Revelation itself and the internal biblical sources. In the meantime, there are a couple more early writers that we need to take a look at. This first one would be Eusebius, which we actually did mention earlier once at least, but I'm going to get a little deeper into it now. So one thing to consider with Eusebius is that there is no debate over translations or anything like that with this person. It is well preserved in its original language and unambiguous. Eusebius does claim that John wrote Revelation during the reign of Domitian. He makes these claims in ecclesiastical history. At the end of the passage most commonly used, he does talk about Irenaeus's writings and the number of the name ascribed to the Antichrist, etc., etc. So one thing to take note of here is that in Eusebius's time, by then, traditions had already been well established. That would mean that the traditional interpretations of writings, not only of the Gospels and the other writings, but also the church fathers and historians before him, will have influenced his writings. One major thing of note is that Eusebius disagrees with Irenaeus on an extremely important and intimately related question, and that is, he disagrees with Irenaeus' position that John the Apostle wrote the book of Revelation at all. Here is an analysis of that and another issue concerning Eusebius' internally self-contradictory statements. Eusebius twice establishes the apostle's longevity based on Irenaeus' confident statement that he talked with an eyewitness of the apostle, Polycarp, who says John wrote Revelation while exiled by Domitian. But in another place, he discounts Irenaeus' teaching that Papias heard John and that John wrote Revelation. If Eusebius believed the one report, why not the other? The two issues that the apostle John wrote Revelation during Domitian's reign are bound up together in Irenaeus. Eusebius also wholeheartedly endorses Clement of Alexandria's account that John not only traveled about the region of Ephesus appointing bishops and reconciling whole churches, but also pulled his John Wayne stunt. It is clear in ecclesiastical histories that he believes John was banished under Domitian, but in evangelical demonstrations he speaks of the execution of Peter and Paul in the same sentence with the banishment of John. This would indicate that when he wrote evangelical demonstrations, at least at that time, he was convinced that the banishment was under Nero. This casts a shadow of doubt on this particular instance of Eusebius' writings. So this is part 9 of the series of When Was Revelation Written, and a pointing to a pre-70 AD writing of that book by the Apostle John. So this last part will be a little rapid fire of a couple of different writers. So this first one is Epiphanius of Salamis, who is noted for stating twice that it was during the emperorship of Claudius. Nero was also called a Claudius and is often called on inscriptions Nero Claudius or Nero Claudius Caesar. So it seems plausible that he was referring to Nero. Scholars who agree with this assessment are Hort, Moffat, Guthrie, Robinson, and Mounts. So the next one here is Jerome. In Against Jovinianum, he writes in 2 parts about the banishment being under the Emperor Domitian, but also about Tertullian's writing of John being boiled in a jar of oil. This adds context that there were 2 traditions running as to when the banishment happened as well as the writing of Revelation. So in the Syriac writings, A History of John the son of Zebedee, we find this. After these things, when the gospel was increasing by the hands of the apostles, Nero, the unclean and impure and wicked king, heard all that had happened at Ephesus. He then sent and took all that the procurator had, and imprisoned him, and laid hold of St. John, and drove him into exile, and passed sentence on the city that it should be laid waste. Both of the Syriac versions of the Revelation hold that John was banished under Nero. In the edition of AD 508, it was actually in the title saying, "Written in Patmos, whither John was sent by Nero Caesar." In Andreas of Cappadocia's commentary on Revelation, we find this. At Revelation 6:12, there are not wanting those who apply this passage to the siege and destruction of Jerusalem by Titus. Referring to Revelation 7:1, he comments, "These things are referred by some to those sufferings which were inflicted by the Romans upon the Jews." This is a 6th century historian giving us a pre-AD 70 date for Revelation. In the writings of Erithus, we also have a commentary on Revelation 6:12. Some refer to this as the siege of Jerusalem by Vespasian, and on Revelation 7:1, here then were manifestly shown to the evangelist what things were to befall the Jews in their war against the Romans in the way of avenging the sufferings inflicted upon Christ. And in Revelation 7:4 commentary, we find, when the evangelist received these oracles, the destruction in which the Jews were involved was not yet inflicted by the Romans. In his preface to a commentary on the Gospel of John, Theophylact puts the banishment of John under Nero when he says John was banished 32 years after the ascension of Christ.